quite shy and introverted, I developed a passion for collecting. I collected stones, I collected insects, boy stuff. I was also curious about understanding the world. Scientific knowledge interested me a lot. Initially, I was interested in everything: astronomy, physics, biology. I would have loved to be an encyclopedist and know everything. At some point, I realized that this was impossible. You then focus on one thing, and the fruit fly was the object of my passion.
Would it be fair to say, from your description of yourself as a child, Bruno, that you were more about understanding the world than understanding people?
C'est possible. C'est possible.
It's possible. I have to say that I wasn't the best person, perhaps, at understanding humans. Could it be this autistic trait which is overrepresented among scientists and which can be an asset? This passion for very specific things? In any case, I found a lot of pleasure in trying to understand the world, in trying to put insects in small boxes, stones in little boxes. Looking at it psychologically, it might have been a response to a certain anxiety, this desire to understand the world, to put it inside little boxes. Although in the end, I will realize later that the world escapes us constantly, and that this goal of trying to understand the world is almost impossible, an endless endeavor. In a way, my passion for insects brought me into contact with other people and gave me a certain recognition within my family. My parents were proud of me. Some friends told me that they were fascinated when they came into my room with all those stones and insects, like a crazy professor. It gave me a certain place in society. I wasn't a good dancer, I wasn't very sociable, but I found my place in the world this way.
This talent for science that you had got you into one of the very top universities in Paris, the École Normale Supérieure. What was it like for you as this young man you've described as slightly awkward, you say slightly autistic, socially sort of naive young man, to go to Paris and have to deal with what you found there?
D'abord, je dirais que, partir de...
First of all, when you arrive in Paris at this young age, you lose the warmth of the family, this protective environment where you don't have to ask yourself any questions. For me, it was a shock, but it opened my mind to an intellectual world. In Paris, I really enjoyed meeting people who were working on other subjects like philosophy or literature. I was very interested in arts and culture. But I was also taken aback by university, where I had already detected a number of political aspects and power strategies. I would also say that my youth as a student was a time of soul-searching. It was a difficult period. Maybe when you have high self-esteem, you can appreciate it to the full. But when you doubt yourself, when you're hesitant, you find yourself facing a very complicated world in which you're going to have to find your place. You're uncertain. You meet some rather extreme personalities, and so I had to navigate it a bit awkwardly because I wasn't always attracted to the nicest people.
Yeah. Tell me more about the politics and the power struggles that you encountered.
Comment dire ça?
How should I say this? The structure of research in France and the French university system is relatively complicated, with a number of administrative layers. I discovered that some professors didn't necessarily recruit the best students, or that often the professor's wife had been hired by the laboratory. There were many cases of favoritism. Maybe I was overly sensitive to them, but I quickly felt that university research wasn't just a quest for pure knowledge or for trying to do the best. It was also a fight for power, for jobs, for recognition. Maybe I was a bit naive when I encountered this very human aspect of research, because after all, it is the human dimension of all communities. It's not just specific to research.
You mentioned earlier that you doubted yourself. Why did you doubt yourself, and how did it affect you?
Si vous voulez, c'est ma nature.
It's in my nature. I've always been someone who doubted himself and doubted his abilities, especially because I wasn't good at speaking. Was I dyslexic? It seems that some of my children are, and I believe that I was as well. It made it harder to communicate. I had the intelligence and the understanding, but I struggled to express it. For instance, I was very bad at English, which is the language of science. All of that would exacerbate my lack of confidence. Over the years, my self-confidence grew. It's a specific process. You move up the hierarchy, you receive a lot of recognition, and there came a point where I felt a bit better. But when I was young, I had this uncertainty, this lack of self-esteem. It wasn't something that I showed to others, but it's something I felt.
You were still a young man when you met the two loves of your life, if you will, with your wife. Let's talk about your wife first. So, who is she? How did you meet? How did she change your life?
J'ai eu la chance, d'une certaine façon, j'ai été forcé à...
After my master's degree, I was forced to do a year of military service. I wasn't very busy there, but during that year I met my wife, Nouad, who is of Lebanese origin. It was a huge change in my life. Coming from a Christian family with strong family values, it was something very important to me, which contributed to my future success. After all, you can have passions like stones and insects and be someone romantic. I always knew that love and family was something extremely important, more important than research. The relationship wasn't easy initially. Nouad had experienced war. She was in France for difficult reasons, but there was a lot of richness, of tenderness. It was also an important step in opening up to others, opening up to love, and to the possibility of having a family. When I was young, even though I wasn't unattractive, I was always afraid that I would end up alone, more anxiety in my life. I could see around me that families were one of the sources of happiness in life. Eventually, we got married 2 or 3 years later. It certainly gave me stability and helped me in my research. Studies show that when you start a relationship, you become more serious, more conscientious. You appreciate life more. You're a bit less stressed. It's something that I felt. Bit by bit, it helped me concentrate and follow another passion, research on the fruit fly.
Fruit flies. So how did you fall in love with fruit flies?
J'ai eu la chance...
I had the good fortune to do an internship near Paris in a lab headed by 3 women researchers who made me discover the fruit fly. I realized there and then that it was the model organism which suited me. I was quite a dreamer. When you're a dreamer and you do chemistry or molecular reactions, you tend to make mistakes, you mix up products. I was quite distracted. With fruit fly research, you could do easier experiments, more aesthetically pleasing, and you would observe quite profound results. That internship, where I was surrounded by these 3 warm-hearted women, was a defining moment. Then I did an internship in Cambridge in the lab of Michael Ashburner, who was a star in the fruit fly world. At that time, research on fruit flies was exploding. Discoveries were being made fast, and we were in the process of discovering the links between genes and more complex questions, like the development of an organism. That strand of research completely captivated me.
Once he had his PhD, the obvious next step for a promising young scientist like Bruno would have been to gain experience in fly labs around the world. But Bruno had just become a father, and he wanted to work closer to home.
J'ai découvert ce laboratoire strasbourgeois.
I discovered this laboratory in Strasbourg, which was run by Jules Hoffmann. The lab was working on the immune system of the fruit fly, but without looking at genetics. Genetics was my expertise, and I knew genetics had proved very powerful to understand other questions. So I fell in love. I told myself, I can discover something here. I can find a place to exist. The laboratory wasn't very well known at the time, but its appeal was to carry out research on how insects defend themselves against infections. I really fell in love with it.
Bruno would indeed discover something in Hoffman's lab, something big, but it would take years of painstaking work to get results.
Il y a toujours un aspect collectif.
There's always a collective aspect to science. You're never the first person to work on something. There are always individuals who influence you. However, there is also a place for an individual to bring certain information together in a new way. For me, that was addressing this issue of how fruit flies respond to infection by using genetics. Sadly, during the first year, I only had negative results.
So was there much input from the head of the laboratory, Professor Hoffman?
Jules Hoffmann était quand même assez...
Jules Hoffmann was quite far from the reality of the work. He was often away travelling, but we didn't mind. He was still interested in what we were doing. There was a favourable environment, people were supporting me, the atmosphere was quite family-like. However, at that time, because we had negative results at the beginning, the team disengaged a bit from genetics and invested less in genetics. Young students who were coming in were pushed away from other approaches. To prove my point, the person who helped me in genetics was actually a cleaner who turned out to be a very good technician. We weren't the lab's priority. But little by little, results came, and there was a moment where everything became clear. From that point on, in 6 weeks, I was able to accumulate a large part of the results. Once you understand the system, things become very simple. A lot of moments along this discovery were moments that I shared with my colleague, Marie Meister, without necessarily informing my supervisors of every small step. It was only afterwards I would go and share the results with them, and then we wrote that paper.
That paper, in 1996, made the cover of a major scientific journal called Cell, a really big deal for a research scientist. The key discovery was that a gene known as Toll, meaning super in German, was essential to flies being able to register infection and so trigger the immune system. Flies without the Toll gene had no way of detecting danger and therefore made no effort to fight back. They were overwhelmed by infection and died. My understanding was, although there is teamwork, this was very much your project. I don't know, is that a fair description?
Si vous voulez, enfin, je suis un peu psychologue.
I'm going to play the psychologist slightly, but the way you take credit or not for research depends on your personality. You can see everything as a collective work, or if you have a big ego, you can credit all the work to yourself. So it's complicated. But I would say that yes, in that Toll article, I played a leading role. But this is where you need to understand that the discovery of Toll-like receptors is not a simple discovery. It's not one eureka moment by someone who would have seen everything. Toll was discovered before me by researchers in Tübingen in Germany. Molecular characterization was carried out in the lab of an important woman in the field named Catherine Anderson. For my part, with my team in the laboratory of Jules Hoffmann, I showed the role of Toll in the immune response. After that, researchers showed the role played by Toll-like receptors in mammals, and there was an explosion in research.
Alors un autre aspect...
Another important aspect is writing up the results. At the beginning, I wrote up the results with the help of my colleague, but then my boss, Jules Hoffmann, who had better writing skills, played a more important role. I appreciated that. When you struggle a bit with writing, having someone who can inject some style into your discovery is important. Jules Hoffmann also contributed to its visibility. He had connections in the biomedical world. That's why it's complicated.
You might have noticed that Bruno is at pains to credit the many people who've contributed to the discovery of Toll and its significance, but there's no doubt as to the importance